Is this on? Yeah. I've realized that the word experienced actually means older. Thank you, Pella. Okay, so I'm from the United States, and this morning I just first want to say I'm very, very happy to be back. And I did challenge Pella the first time, and the reason I didn't challenge her the second time about why are you doing this and why should I join you, was because there is stuff happening here. And it's incredible what's beginning to develop. And I have to say that I'm just delighted to be back, but also delighted to see the things that are beginning to happen here in Sweden. And that if I can play a role, I want to play a role. And so we're going to be having a number of meetings while I'm here as well. So we have this conference, which is incredible. And we also have meetings about Lake Vatten coming up, meetings with the Swedish EPA, meetings with Swedish parliamentarians and NGOs. And so that's a lot of development. That's incredible. And let's see what we can do. So, as you probably know, the United States has the United States Congress, and the United States Congress is divided into the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. And within each state in the United States, there is a legislature that also has a House and a Senate. And the reason I'm telling you this is because in the state of Ohio, which is in the eastern part of the United States, yesterday, the House of Representatives in the state of Ohio voted on a proposed legislation, and I wanted to just begin today by reading to you what they voted on yesterday. They wrote into this proposed law, quote, "No person on behalf of or representing nature shall bring an action in any court." Quote, "Nature does not have standing to participate in or bring an action in any court." And this is how they define nature. Nature, generally areas that are not human or human creations, have not been substantially altered by humans or that persist despite human intervention. Now, you might say, that's terrible. It's terrible. But it might surprise you to know that this, in the United States, is cause for celebration. Because this is the first state legislature in the United States to even mention the idea that nature may have rights. The first to mention rights of nature. And so we celebrate this moment because this is a moment in which the pushback, the response, the reaction by the system is beginning to demonstrate and manifest itself. And so they're being forced into a position to respond to us, to this growing movement that involves all of us here. They have to take action to try to stop us. And that is an incredibly important moment in any movement. And today we have a new movement building, a new people's movement for nature. So I think we need to celebrate. Now, of course, there's plenty not to celebrate. Earlier this week, of course, there was the report released about how 1 million species on the planet are at substantial risk of extinction, of course, at human hand. And today, of course, we're heading into the 6th great extinction. We're in the Anthropocene, meaning that humankind has substantially altered or affected or influenced every place on the earth, ecosystems, as well as species, and even the United Nations is saying that we need to make a substantial transformational change in how we behave on the planet, putting our life systems very much at risk unless we do and transform to something different. So we know these things. You know, global warming, climate change. Last year was the 3rd warmest, hottest year on recorded human history. ecosystems like coral reefs are bleaching and dying all over the planet. Species, of course, going extinct at more than 1,000 times natural background rates. And this is all due to human activity. It's our fault. And so it's our responsibility to make the change. But in order to make the change that is necessary, we cannot continue doing the same stuff we've been doing. We cannot continue doing the same shit, or it's going to end. Our own lives will be at risk. So let's talk about first today, what are we doing right now that clearly is not working? So we have environmental laws here in Sweden, in the United States, all over the world. There are stacks of environmental laws, right? So these environmental laws and legal systems in general, they treat nature as something other. That is, they treat nature as property, or they treat it as an item of commerce. And so environmental laws are all about how do we regulate that property? How do we regulate nature? That is, how do we regulate the use of nature to serve humankind? Which is why environmental laws largely are about legalizing how we use the environment. That is, legalizing activities such as fracking, or mining, or industrial farming, or GMOs, and so forth and so on. Legalizing on purpose known environmental harms because we're legalizing exploitation of the earth. And it's no wonder, right, that we're in a situation where we're literally ripping holes in the very fabric of life. Because our environmental laws are about regulating and allowing and authorizing harm of the environment. So environmental laws are largely about not protecting the environment, which is not what we get told. And we have, of course, environmental protection agencies, for example, which make us think that we're protecting the environment. This relationship that we have with nature is in our laws, it's in our cultures, it's in our societies, that nature exists for our use, and therefore legal systems are all about how do we use nature as fast as possible to build wealth, to build power, to build control. Brazil's Superior Court very recently issued a decision in which it called upon the need for recognizing legal rights of nature. And they described this relationship that humankind has with the natural world. And they described that relationship as, quote, domination. We dominate the earth, we control the earth, which is why we have laws that talk about things like forest management or species management, fisheries management, because it's all about how do we manage, control, and regulate the use of nature to serve our needs and wants. And that doesn't work because we've used it up. We've pushed nature past the brink, and it's time for us to change. And so the question becomes, what do we do? And what's needed, what we believe is needed, is a fundamental transformation in humankind's relationship with the natural world. And what does that mean? Well, if we look at other movements, that people's movements over time that looked at their legal systems and found them to be systemically oppressive and unjust, they had to transform those legal systems, which meant transforming who was recognized as having rights, which transformed who was recognized as having protection under the law. Today, nature is not recognized as having rights under the law. Nature is not recognized as being worthy of protection or having, as Brazil's Superior Court wrote, having intrinsic value. We don't recognize that in our law because nature is there to serve us. So this idea of recognizing rights of nature, it's not just a nice, shiny, new idea. It's actually about a fundamental transformation in law, and of course in society as well, to support that change. But it's a fundamental transformation, not only in just how we talk about nature or think about nature, but how we govern ourselves toward nature, moving us into a place where we're no longer looking at the world through a legal lens that is anthropocentric, that is a human relationship. How do we get as much as we need from the earth, but instead one that is ecocentric. And that's what the rights of nature is. It's about a fundamental change to recognize that nature itself, ecosystem, species, the planet, has legally enforceable rights. Rights such as the basic right to exist, the right to thrive, the right to flourish, the right to regenerate, the right that naturally evolve, and of course the right to be restored. It's this fundamental transformation to recognize something as from being property to actually being rights-bearing. That is, from rightless to rights-bearing, much like past peoples have had to struggle for rights, that they were treated as property. Women were treated as property under the law and had to be transformed through struggle, through people's movements, in order to be recognized as rights-bearing. Today, nature is sitting in that rightless place, as a place, an item of commerce or property, needs to be transformed into being rights-bearing, so that not only we can go into court, but nature itself can go into court to defend and enforce its own rights. And that's the highest form of legal protection that we have in the law. That is the recognition of legal rights. So Pella mentioned Ecuador. Ecuador is the first country in the world to secure and enshrine the rights of nature, or Pachamama, in its national constitution. This idea that nature can have fundamental rights under the law, that is a fundamental transformation, changing thousands of years of history of our relationship with nature. And that, we believe, is what's needed now today. And it's necessary to secure it in the law, so that it's not just about, us buying organic food or recycling, but actually securing it into the law so that we can make decisions in court, as I know you'll hear about, that courts recognize that certain ecosystems have legal rights, and through direct lawmaking, both at the national level and below that. And where has this been happening? In the United States, the first rights of nature law in the world was recognized in 2006, and my organization worked with a small community in Pennsylvania to secure legal rights of nature for the first time, that nature itself has rights. Ecuador in 2008 in its national constitution. Today we have local laws in Brazil recognizing nature's rights. Bolivia has a rights of Mother Earth law. There have been court decisions in Colombia and India and elsewhere recognizing that certain ecosystems have legal rights. This represents a vast transformation in the law. And that's why places like the state of Ohio are beginning to push back, because they can see the writing on the wall. So I wanted to talk to you today about some recent developments in the United States in particular around the rights of nature. In December, the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, they're part of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe in the state of Minnesota, they passed a law called the Rights of Menomen. Menomen is wild rice, part of their traditional ancestral staple foods. And because of global warming, because of pollution, because of being forced off their lands, they no longer have the wild rice, which is a staple food for them. They no longer have access to it. The habitat's being destroyed. And so they felt the need to pass a law to recognize that Menomen itself has legal rights. This represents the very first law to recognize specific rights of a particular plant species. So in itself is a transformational law, but it's also transformational, of course, for the people. And this is intended to help them not only protect Menomen, but its wild rice habitat, and to fend off threats such as pipelines that threaten their habitat, and such as global warming, and to protect it both not only on their recognized reservation lands, but off reservation in a way that has not been recognized before. So it's a really fundamental change in law, and fortunately that's gotten a lot of notice, so that you have not only other tribal nations, but other peoples in other places that are saying, how will we do this as well? So we're hoping they'll be able to successfully replicate that law in other places. And then the other law I wanted to talk to you about is called the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. Lake Erie is one of the Great Lakes, and is the 11th largest lake in the world. It happens to be in the state of Ohio. And the Lake Erie Bill of Rights is the very first law in the United States to recognize specific rights of an ecosystem. In this case, of course, a water ecosystem. The people of Toledo, Ohio, which voted on the Lake Erie Bill of Rights in February, they had their water cut off, their drinking water, several years ago, because we have significant industrial agriculture, what we call factory farms, in the state of Ohio, and pollution from those farms runs off and goes into the lake. And that's a primary polluter of Lake Erie. And as a result of that, there are these constant algae blooms. And several years ago, the algae bloom was so toxic and so large that it prevented the people of Toledo from actually being able to get their drinking water from Lake Erie, which they do. And so they cut off the drinking water, and you can imagine that people were suddenly made aware, if they hadn't been already, of what significant harm we've been doing legally to Lake Erie. And when I say legally, what I mean is that the laws allow this to happen. And that means that the people began to mobilize. And we worked with an organization called Toledans for Safe Water, and they've done an incredible job of mobilizing and educating their community to talk about what the threat is to Lake Erie, how the system of law itself is allowing and authorizing this pollution, and that something fundamental needs to change. They've looked to the federal government, they looked to their state government, and they found no hope there. Nobody else was going to save them, and they felt the need to take matters into their own hands. So we worked with them not only to help them educate and organize in the community, but to develop a law to recognize rights of Lake Erie, rights of the ecosystem to exist, to thrive, to evolve, and importantly, the right of the people and the right of the lake itself to defend and enforce those rights. So if there were threats such as industrial agriculture or factory farms that were occurring, that they would be able to defend against those things because they would be a violation of the fundamental legal rights of the lake. So when you start talking about those sorts of things, people start to listen, certain people, particularly corporate agriculture, and the governments that serve industry and corporations, and at least in my country. And so they drafted this law, they proposed the law, and we have something called direct democracy in the United States in certain places in which people can develop a law themselves, and because they couldn't find any help within existing governmental institutions or elected officials, they proposed the law themselves, they collected signatures to put it on a ballot. And the first thing that happened was that there was an effort by government officials to prevent the people from even voting on this proposed law. And so we had to go to court to defend their right to actually have a democratic right to decide whether or not to recognize the rights of Lake Erie. And after significant fight and struggle, they were actually able to get it on the ballot in February of this year, at the end of that month. And then, of course, they had to organize their community, yes. So what we're talking about here is pushback. So first they tried to stomp on the people's right to democracy because they don't want the people to be able to vote on this. They don't want people to be able to campaign for this because once you start having that conversation in your community, people start to go, well, hold on. Maybe we should recognize rights of Lake Erie or rights of nature in generally. So by preventing people from even voting on it means you prevent people from even having the debate on the merits, right? The idea itself. So they tried to stop that by thwarting their democratic rights. The people were able to overcome that. And so then they went into campaign mode, and at the end of February, there was a citywide vote of the people of Toledo. And they voted in favor, by over 60%, to recognize rights of Lake Erie for the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And you had CNN and the New York Times and the Guardian and other news outlets around the world talking about this and writing about this. So they voted on a Tuesday night. Wednesday morning, about 12 hours later, the first lawsuit was filed against the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. So that's the second kind of pushback that we face. First, they try to prevent you from voting, and then once you voted, they try to overturn your vote. This is important. This is absolutely, we could write a textbook on the kind of response that you're going to get when you try to make transformational change. So they've sued to overturn it. It's an agricultural company that is sued to overturn it, a corporation. And the state of Ohio has actually intervened on behalf of the agricultural industry to help them overturn this law. So that's in court, and we're helping the people of Toledo try to fight that in court. Then the third thing happened, of course, is that it wasn't enough for the state to actually try to intervene and successfully do so into this lawsuit on the side of the ag industry. They also, in the House of Representatives yesterday, voted that nature cannot be represented in court. And that nature, what did they say? That nature, that thing that persists despite human intervention. So that's the kind of pushback. And it's the kind of pushback that we need to expect when we're trying to push for transformational change. So we should celebrate this action because it's a reaction to something actually working. It's a reaction to them seeing that people are beginning to think that something fundamentally different needs to occur. And it reveals this reaction when they respond to us in this way by suing us, by going into state legislatures, and soon enough, I'm sure the US Congress will try to push back as well. They're a little busy right now with some other things. But we should celebrate this because this kind of response reveals how the system works, who controls things, who has the decision-making power, and what they will do to try to hold on to that control. And that is an absolutely essential element of any successful people's movement. So we should be prepared for it, we should anticipate it, and we should know that when it comes, it means we're doing something right. So we should celebrate it. And the last thought that I'll lead with you is, we need to build a new people's movement for nature. That has begun. And it's begun through the organizing and the mobilization and the lawmaking that is occurring in the United States, in Ecuador, Bolivia, and other places. And it happens only because we demand the kind of change, because we force that kind of change. It doesn't happen if we wait and expect our elected officials or our governmental institutions to take the lead. They don't lead, they follow. So it's up to every one of us to come together, to join together, to mobilize together, because we need to be the leaders. The people of Toledo are leading. We need to join them and people around the world. It's the people that lead. It's them that will follow. Thank you.